The storm rolled over the valley like a restless beast, its thunder shaking the distant ridges, while streaks of lightning tore the sky into jagged shards of silver. Rain hammered the land in sheets, drumming on rooftops, soaking the soil, and rushing in streams down forgotten gullies. On the edge of the old frontier town, where pastures stretched endlessly and silence usually reigned, a lone rider pressed forward through the downpour. His oilskin coat clung to his frame, and his hat brim sagged beneath the weight of water. Each breath fogged in the cold air as his horse trudged steadily along the muddy track that led toward the abandoned mine. Elias Kane had lived much of his life alone. Once a promising rancher with dreams of building something lasting, he now carried the burden of broken ventures and a reputation that had turned neighbors into wary acquaintances. They called him stubborn, unlucky, a man too scarred by the past to find his way forward. Years of hardship had carved quiet lines into his face, and though his shoulders remained broad, his spirit bore a heaviness that never seemed to lift. Tonight, though, something stronger than loneliness pushed him toward the mine, a place even the boldest men avoided after sundown. The mine had been sealed a century ago after a collapse buried dozens of workers and their animals beneath stone. The wooden beams still jutted like blackened ribs from the mountainside, warped by time, slick with moss and rot. Folks said the place was haunted, cursed by the voices of men who never made it home. Elias didn't believe in ghost stories, not really, but he carried his grandfather's warnings like echoes in the back of his mind. Still, something had drawn him here. As lightning flared again, a sound cut through the storm, a sharp, desperate cry that pierced the night and rooted him to the spot. He reined in his horse, head tilted, listening. The wind howled through the rocks, but the cry came again, rising over the storm. It wasn't human. It was the anguished scream of an animal in pain. Elias's pulse quickened. He swung down from his saddle, boots sinking into the mud, and followed the sound toward the sealed tunnel mouth. There, half buried in a tumble of stone and soil, a horse struggled weakly against the weight of rubble. Its flanks heaved with exhaustion, and its eyes rolled with terror. Elias rushed forward, dropping to his knees in the muck. The creature's coat, beneath the layers of mud and blood, gleamed a ghostly gray, as if it carried the dust of centuries. Every muscle trembled as it tried to rise, only to collapse again, pinned by the stones. "Easy now," Elias murmured, his voice low, steady, the same tone he had once used to calm spooked cattle. He braced his hands against the jagged rocks, ignoring the sting as they cut into his skin, and began to haul them aside. One by one, he freed the animal's body, until at last the horse shuddered violently and rolled onto its side, drawing in ragged breaths. The sight of the wounds carved into its flesh made Elias's throat tighten. Deep gashes scored the animal's legs and shoulders, and an unnatural mark, a long, thin scar that spiraled across its hide, caught his eye. Something about it felt deliberate, almost carved, as though the horse itself bore a story older than memory. The horse flinched as he reached for it, eyes flashing with mistrust. Elias drew his hand back, rain streaming down his face. He knew that look. He had seen it in his own reflection too many times. The look of something broken, unwilling to trust, yet unwilling to give up. Slowly, he stripped off his soaked gloves and tried again, laying his palm gently against the horse's neck. The animal shivered, then stilled, chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "I've got you," Elias whispered. "You're not alone out here." He fashioned a makeshift sling from his reins and coaxed the horse to its feet, guiding it through the storm toward his ranch. Each step was a struggle, but the animal followed, as though some instinct tethered them together. By the time they reached the barn, both man and beast were staggering with exhaustion. Inside, the lantern light flickered against the wooden walls, casting long shadows over the stalls. Elias dried the horse with burlap, his movements careful, deliberate. He cleaned its wounds with what supplies he had, murmuring encouragement as the creature resisted every touch. It took hours, but eventually the horse lay quiet in the straw, eyes half closed, chest finally easing into a steadier rhythm. Elias sank onto a stool nearby, watching it. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt a pull toward this animal, as if their meeting was not chance, but something written long before. As he worked, his fingers brushed against a tangle in the horse's mane. He paused, frowning, and carefully untangled the strands. Nestled within was a small metallic trinket, rusted with age, its surface etched with a symbol he recognized from childhood stories, a miner's insignia, a crest said to mark the men who vanished in the Great Collapse. Elias turned it over in his palm, his heart pounding. This horse hadn't stumbled out of nowhere. It had come from the tunnel. The thought made the hair on the back of his neck rise. The tunnel had been sealed for 100 years. How could anything living emerge from its depths? And yet here it was, breathing, wounded, but alive. That night, when the storm finally gave way to silence, Elias lay restless in his narrow bed. Rain dripped from the eaves outside, but another sound reached him, an eerie whinny from the barn. He rose, pulling on his boots, and stepped into the night. The horse was standing, head raised, ears pricked toward the mountainside. Its body trembled, not from pain but from something else, something deeper. Elias followed its gaze. In the distance, the outline of the mine loomed black against the clearing sky. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard it too. The faint echo of voices, low and mournful, carried on the wind. He shook his head, telling himself it was nothing but imagination. Yet when he turned back, the horse's eyes burned with a strange intensity, locked onto the sealed tunnel, as though it remembered every stone that entombed it. A chill moved through Elias's chest. He could not deny what he had seen, what he had felt in the presence of this wounded stranger. Something waited in that tunnel, something long buried but not forgotten. He rested his hand against the stall door, watching the animal shift uneasily in the straw. For the first time in years, Elias felt not just the weight of solitude but the stirrings of purpose. He did not yet know what story this horse carried, but he knew with certainty that their paths were now bound together. As dawn's first light broke across the valley, Elias whispered a promise into the quiet barn. "Whatever's in those shadows, we'll face it together." The horse turned its head, eyes glinting in the pale glow, and exhaled a slow, steady breath, as though answering. And somewhere beyond the hills, the tunnel waited, holding its secrets close, daring him to return. The sun rose pale and weak over the valley, its light stretching across the wet fields, turning raindrops into fleeting sparks on the grass. In the barn, Elias stirred from a restless doze, the hard stool beneath him leaving his back stiff and aching. He had stayed close all night, watching the horse breathe, listening for every shift of hooves in the straw. The storm had passed, but a heaviness lingered in the air, the kind that suggested nothing had truly ended. When the horse moved, Elias noticed the change at once. Its eyes were clearer, less glazed with pain, though mistrust still flickered within them. Slowly, cautiously, he approached with a bucket of water. The animal eyed him, ears pinned back, but thirst won over suspicion. Its muzzle dipped into the pail, drinking greedily, the sound of gulps echoing in the quiet barn. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Life was still there, fragile, but burning. Over the next days, a rhythm emerged. Elias tended the horse's wounds, cleaned its stall, and offered grain and hay. At first, every gesture was met with defiance. The horse shied from his hands, snapped its head away, kicked at the stall when he drew too near. But Elias persisted, speaking in low tones, never forcing, always waiting. His patience began to wear through the armor of distrust. By the end of the week, the horse tolerated his touch, even leaned into it when he brushed its mane with slow, steady strokes. He found himself talking as he worked, words spilling out that had long been locked inside. He spoke of the land, of the failures that had marked his life, of the silence that haunted his nights. He hadn't meant to confess anything, not to a creature that couldn't answer, but the horse listened in its way, ears twitching, eyes steady, as though it understood more than most men ever had. One evening, as dusk settled over the valley, Elias led the horse from the barn into the paddock. Its steps were uncertain, limping, but there was strength in the way it held its head. The wind carried the scent of wet earth, and the horizon burned gold with the last rays of sun. For a moment, Elias felt something stir deep inside him, a flicker of pride, perhaps even hope. But questions gnawed at him. Every time the horse turned toward the mountain where the tunnel lay sealed, he felt the same unease. It wasn't chance that had brought the animal there. He knew it, and when his fingers brushed the rusted trinket again, hidden in his pocket, he wondered if he had uncovered something far greater than an injured stray. A week later, Elias made the trip into town, the trinket wrapped in cloth in his coat pocket. He walked the narrow main street, boots striking the boardwalk, the gazes of townsfolk following him as they always did. Some nodded politely, others turned away, but all knew who he was, the man who had once dreamed big and fallen hard. He found what he was looking for in the back of the dusty general store, an old historian named Jonah, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a memory for stories most had long forgotten. Elias laid the object on the counter. Jonah's gaze sharpened the moment he saw it. "Where'd you find this?" the old man asked, voice hushed. "On a horse," Elias replied simply. Jonah picked it up, turning it carefully in the lamplight. "This is a miner's crest. Belonged to the guild that worked the old shaft before it collapsed. I haven't seen one in decades. Thought they were all buried with the men who carried them." Elias leaned closer. "You're sure?" "Certain." Jonah's brow furrowed. "They say a stallion roamed those tunnels, belonged to the foreman. Strongest animal anyone ever saw. Carried men out of danger more than once. When the explosion came, he vanished with the rest. Folks whispered he was buried alive down there, waiting in the dark." Elias's mouth went dry. "And if he wasn't?" Jonah looked up sharply. "Then the past isn't as buried as we thought." The words lingered in Elias's mind long after he left. That night, as he brushed the horse's coat, he studied its eyes. There was something there, something beyond mere survival, a history carved into every scar. He wondered if time had bent around this creature, if somehow it carried the weight of generations. The thought unsettled him, but it also kindled a strange determination. The horse began to grow stronger, and with strength came spirit. One morning, when Elias opened the stall, the animal bolted past him, galloping across the pasture with a ferocity that stole his breath. Its mane whipped in the wind, hooves thundering against the earth, a vision of raw power and freedom. Elias gave chase, laughing despite himself, until the horse finally slowed at the far fence. It stood there, chest heaving, eyes locked once more on the dark line of the mountain. That gaze unsettled him more than ever. It wasn't simply curiosity, it was recognition. The horse knew what lay inside that sealed shaft. It remembered. Days later, Elias was joined unexpectedly by an old ranch hand named Marcus, a man who had worked alongside his father years before. Marcus leaned on the fence, squinting at the animal with weathered eyes. "Fine-looking beast you've got there," he said. "But there's something off about it. Reminds me of stories I heard when I was a boy." Elias glanced at him. "What kind of stories?" Marcus spat into the dirt. "About the mine. About the cries that sometimes echo from inside when the wind shifts. They said a horse's spirit was trapped in there, restless. Folks claimed if you listened too long, it'd drive you mad." Elias shook his head, though unease prickled at his skin. "This horse isn't a spirit. It's flesh and blood." Marcus gave a slow nod, though his eyes never left the animal. "Maybe so. But don't fool yourself, Elias. Some things should stay buried. Dig too deep, and you might not like what you find." The warning stayed with Elias long after Marcus left. That night, he lay awake, listening. The ranch was silent, but when the wind shifted, he could have sworn he heard it again, the faint sound of hooves striking stone, echoing from the direction of the tunnel. The horse stirred restlessly in its stall, stamping the ground, nostrils flaring. Elias rose and opened the door, and without hesitation the animal stepped out, leading him across the pasture under the pale glow of the moon. They reached the far edge, where the mountain loomed like a shadow over the valley. The horse pawed at the earth, and when Elias crouched beside it, he saw the soil disturbed, loose, as though hiding something beneath. He dug with his hands until the outline of an iron marker appeared, half buried in the dirt. It glowed faintly in the moonlight, stamped with the same insignia as the trinket. Elias's breath caught. This was no accident. The horse had led him here. The animal whinnied softly, eyes gleaming, and Elias felt the weight of destiny press against him. Something waited beyond those stones, something that had survived a century of silence. And for the first time in years, he felt both fear and exhilaration, knowing the path ahead would change everything he thought he understood. The mountain loomed like a silent sentinel as dusk fell across the valley, its jagged ridges glowing faintly in the last light of day. Elias stood at the edge of the pasture, one hand resting on the horse's neck, the other gripping a lantern. The discovery of the buried marker had haunted him for days, gnawing at his thoughts each time he tried to sleep. He had resisted, telling himself Marcus was right, that some secrets should remain sealed. But the horse would not allow it. Night after night, it led him to the same spot, pawing at the earth as though demanding he act. Eventually, Elias stopped fighting the pull. He packed lightly, rope, a pick, and the lantern, and returned to the mountain's base. The horse followed without need of rein or command, its eyes glinting in the fading light. When they reached the weathered timbers of the old mine entrance, Elias hesitated. The wood beams sagged with age, moss draped over them like a shroud. A cold wind breathed from the cracks in the stone, carrying the smell of damp earth and something older, metallic and sharp. "Here we are," Elias murmured, voice steady though his stomach churned. The horse stamped its hoof and tossed its head as though answering. With a deep breath, Elias wedged his pick into the loosened soil where the marker lay. The ground gave way reluctantly, then crumbled. Stones tumbled aside, revealing a narrow opening blacker than night itself. Lantern light flickered weakly against the darkness. Elias ducked and pushed forward, the horse following close, its body tense but determined. The air grew colder as they descended, each step echoing in the hollow corridor. Water dripped from above, and the smell of rot and rust thickened. Elias's pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced his breathing calm. This was not just curiosity, it was necessity. The deeper they moved, the more the walls closed in, pressing like the weight of a buried world. Wooden beams leaned precariously, splintered by time, threatening to collapse with a single breath too strong. Elias raised the lantern high. Shadows leapt across the rough stone, stretching and twisting like restless spirits. Then he saw it. Carvings lined the walls, faint but unmistakable, figures of horses etched into the rock, their bodies drawn with reverence, their eyes large and unyielding. Elias brushed the stone with his fingertips, tracing the grooves. These were not idle sketches. They were marks of devotion, the miners' way of honoring the animals that had carried them, suffered with them, died beside them. The horse shifted uneasily, its breath steaming in the chill air. Further in, the passage widened into a cavern littered with remnants of another age. Broken helmets lay scattered, rusted picks and shattered carts crumbled into heaps of decay. But most haunting were the bones, dozens of them, tangled in heaps, brittle and pale as ivory. Elias swallowed hard, lowering the lantern. Some were human, collapsed where they had fallen. Others, larger, were unmistakably equine. Saddles rotted on ribcages, reins tangled like cobwebs. The horse halted, lowering its head. For a moment, silence reigned but for the drip of water. Elias felt the weight of it settle in his chest. He knew loss, knew failure. But this was sacrifice frozen in time. As they pressed onward, a low groan shuddered through the earth. Dust rained from the ceiling, beams creaked, and stones shifted. Elias froze, scanning the tunnel. Then, with a thunderous crack, part of the passage collapsed behind him, sealing the way out. He coughed through the haze, shielding the lantern's flame. Panic surged in his chest, but before he could move, the horse shoved against him with surprising force, guiding him forward, deeper into the tunnel. They stumbled through the falling debris, stones striking the ground around them. Elias pulled against the reins, but the horse forged ahead with a strength that refused surrender. Together, they burst into another chamber, the collapse thundering to a close behind them. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias leaned against the wall, chest heaving, lantern trembling in his hand. The horse pressed close, its flank warm against his shoulder. Slowly, Elias raised the light, revealing what the chamber concealed. At the far wall stood a door carved directly into the stone, its surface sealed with iron bands. though rust had eaten through them in places. Upon it was a great insignia, an emblem of a horse rearing, its mane flowing like fire. Elias's breath caught. This was no ordinary barrier. It was a shrine, a vault. His hand shook as he pushed against the rusted iron. The door groaned, then gave way, opening into a smaller chamber untouched by time. Inside, the air was still dry, preserved. Wooden crates sat stacked in neat rows, their lids branded with the miner's crest. Some had burst open, spilling coins that glimmered faintly in the lantern light. But it was not the treasure that stole Elias's breath. On a stone pedestal lay journals, their leather covers cracked but intact. He lifted one with trembling hands and flipped it open. Scrawled ink told the story of the final days. Men trapped, air thinning, hope dwindling. But again and again, one figure was mentioned, a stallion named Ashfire, the foreman's horse. It had carried men out of collapses, dragged carts when machines failed, fought exhaustion until the end. When the final blast came, they wrote, Ashfire was last seen charging into the dark to drag another miner clear. No one ever saw him again. Elias's throat tightened as he read. He turned slowly to the horse beside him, lantern light flickering across its scarred hide. Could it be possible? Could this creature be the same, carried forward through time, preserved by something no man could explain? The horse lifted its head, eyes gleaming with a depth Elias had never seen in an animal before. It stepped forward, nostrils flaring, and pressed its muzzle against the journal, as though recognizing the words, the story, its own name whispered across a century. Elias's knees weakened. He had thought himself cursed with solitude, doomed to carry the weight of his failures alone. But here stood a companion bound not only to him, but to history itself, a survivor whose scars carried the voice of the past. A distant rumble shook the chamber, snapping him back. The tunnel groaned again, louder this time, as though the mountain resented their intrusion. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, and the iron door rattled in its hinges. Elias clutched the journal to his chest and looked at the horse. "We have to go," he whispered. The animal neighed sharply, rearing against the shifting ground, and for the first time, Elias didn't feel like he was leading it. He felt like it was leading him. Together, they turned toward the dark passage ahead, away from the collapsing chamber and the treasure left behind. Coins spilled across the floor as crates burst open, but Elias didn't look back. Gold meant nothing now. What mattered was survival. What mattered was the truth they carried. The lantern flame sputtered, nearly extinguished by the trembling earth. Elias tightened his grip on the handle, pressing forward into the narrow corridor. Behind him, the chamber cracked and thundered, the past crumbling to dust. Ahead, the darkness stretched endlessly, daring them to continue. And as they moved deeper, the journal's words echoed in his mind. Ashfire waits in the dark. Elias swallowed hard, lantern trembling, and whispered into the silence, "Then let's find out who you really are." The tunnel trembled as though the mountain itself had awoken, groaning with the weight of centuries. Stones cracked and splintered, beams buckled, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. Elias gripped the lantern tighter, its flame sputtering against the rising dust. His lungs burned with every breath, but he forced his body forward. The horse stayed close, its hooves striking the ground with steady rhythm, its presence anchoring him in the chaos. Every step deeper felt like walking into the maw of something alive, something that wanted them buried alongside the miners, who had never left. The journal clutched in Elias's coat pressed like a heartbeat against his chest. He couldn't let it be lost. It was proof. Proof of sacrifice. Proof of survival. Proof that the horse beside him was not merely chance, but a living story that had waited 100 years to be told. The passage narrowed until Elias had to crouch, his shoulders scraping the jagged walls. The horse hesitated, nostrils flaring, before lowering its head and pushing through. The bond between them now was unspoken but absolute. The fear Elias had once seen in its eyes was gone, replaced by something fierce, almost defiant. He realized then that the animal wasn't following him out of gratitude. It was leading him, demanding that the truth not be left to rot beneath stone. A thunderous crack split the air. Behind them, the chamber they had left gave way entirely, a roar of collapsing rock, chasing them like an avalanche. Elias stumbled, nearly losing the lantern, but the horse shoved against him, driving him onward. Dust blinded him, stung his eyes, filled his mouth with grit, but he staggered forward, refusing to let go. He could not die here. Not when he finally felt alive again. They burst into a larger corridor, and Elias's lantern revealed what looked like the mine's main shaft. Rusted rails ran along the ground, twisted and broken. Old carts lay overturned, half swallowed by rubble. And ahead, faint but real, was a current of fresh air whispering through a crack in the stone. Elias's heart surged. "There," he gasped. The horse answered with a sharp neigh and surged forward, pulling him into a sprint. Rocks rained from above, shattering against the ground where they had stood moments before. The mountain was collapsing around them, furious at their intrusion. Elias leapt over broken beams, stumbled, righted himself, always clutching the journal close. The horse moved with a strength that defied its wounds, carrying itself as though the weight of history lent it power. At last they reached the crack in the wall. Sunlight pierced through in thin, golden strands, so bright it stung Elias's eyes. He slammed the pick against the stone, again and again, until his arms shook with exhaustion. The horse struck the wall with its hooves, each blow echoing like thunder. Together, man and animal forced the mountain to yield. With a final crack, the stone gave way. Daylight spilled into the tunnel in a flood of brilliance. Elias stumbled out first, dragging in the sweet air of freedom. The horse followed, leaping through the gap as the ground behind them split with a deafening roar. They tumbled into the open valley as the entrance sealed shut in an explosion of rock and dust. Silence followed, vast and overwhelming. Elias lay on his back, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the sky now painted with the hues of late afternoon. Beside him, the horse rolled onto its side, nostrils flaring, body coated in dust but alive. Alive. Against all odds, alive. It took hours before they staggered back toward the ranch, Elias leaning heavily against the animal's shoulder, the journal still pressed tightly to his chest. By the time they reached the barn, a small crowd had gathered. Word of the collapse had traveled fast. Neighbors who once dismissed him now stood with wide eyes, staring at the man who had walked out of the mountain, carrying a ghost of the past. Jonah, the old historian, pushed through the crowd, his hands trembling as Elias handed him the journal. He opened it, scanning the fragile pages, tears welling in his eyes. "It's true," he whispered hoarsely. "The stallion, Ashfire, he saved them until the very end." Elias turned to the horse, his throat tightening. Ashfire. The name fit like destiny. The old ranch hand, Marcus, removed his hat, awe softening the hard lines of his weathered face. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "That horse ain't just flesh and bone. He's legacy." The townsfolk, once skeptical of Elias, now watched with something new, respect. For the first time in years, Elias didn't feel the weight of failure pressing him down. He felt part of something larger, something enduring. He hadn't found treasure in the tunnel. He had found purpose, found trust, found a bond that had waited a century to be rediscovered. Days turned to weeks, and the story spread. People came from miles away to see the horse that had walked out of history. Some came with reverence, others with doubt, but all left changed after standing in Ashfire's presence. The scars on his hide told a story words could never capture, and his eyes carried a depth that silenced even the most cynical. For Elias, life shifted in quiet ways. He rose each morning not to face solitude, but to greet a companion who had endured as he had endured. Together, they worked the land, rode the pastures, and healed wounds that ran deeper than flesh. Trust grew between them until reins were no longer needed. Ashfire followed Elias freely, a shadow bound not by force but by choice. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blazed orange, Elias stood at the fence line, watching Ashfire gallop across the field. The horse moved with power and grace, each stride a defiance of time itself. Elias felt his chest swell, tears stinging his eyes. He thought of the miners who had written those last desperate words, of the horse that had refused to abandon them, of the tunnel that had finally surrendered its secret. He whispered into the wind, "You were never meant to be forgotten." Ashfire slowed, turning his head as if he had heard, then charged forward again, mane whipping in the light, hooves drumming a rhythm that echoed through the valley. The townsfolk who gathered that evening stood in silence, no words sufficient for what they witnessed. Elias didn't need their praise. The sight of ash fire free beneath the open sky was enough. In that moment he knew the truth. Redemption had not come from proving himself to others, but from learning to trust again, to open his heart where once it had been closed. As night fell and stars pricked the heavens, Elias leaned against the fence, a quiet smile on his face. The past no longer haunted him. It lived beside him, breathing, running, reminding him that some stories do not end. They endure, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And as the horse's silhouette vanished into the dark horizon, Elias spoke softly, almost a prayer. Some stories never die. They only wait to be found. The wind carried his words, and somewhere deep inside, he felt the mountain finally rest. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.